Okay, so I think with that, we're going to jump into this and get started. Today we are, so just a couple of reminders as we jump into this educators call. All participants are muted. So today we are hoping or planning on hosting a good amount of discussion about presenting Subpart E, the pre-harvest agricultural water requirements. So we will be giving you just instructions a little bit later if you are interested in being unmuted on how to do so. But for right now, all participants are muted. The chat box is open, the Q&A box, the chat box is open, so feel free to use that. There will be time for questions and discussion throughout this meeting, as well as at the end of the webinar. And just a reminder, the session will be recorded and the presentation will be shared via the listserv and on our website after the call. So the agenda for this webinar today is talking through sort of a summary of questions that PSA, the Produce Safety Alliance, has been receiving on our Subpart E pre-harvest agricultural water, our outreach and our webinars. But I would say the main goal of today's webinar is to give you all, our educators, the opportunity to give input and share some of the questions that you've been hearing, the discussions that you've been hearing when you deliver these pre-harvest agricultural water requirements. So I did want to give you a heads up right now that we will be asking you to share your experiences in a few slides. We have some polls today, and then I will be asking people to use the chat box and just open up and verbally share your experiences. We are going to wrap up with a discussion of some of our new resources. I know throughout other webinars that Produce Safety Alliance has been hosting and our other outreach, we've been talking about some of our new fact sheets here and there. But I wanted to give a chance to just talk you through some of those new resources, especially the agricultural water assessment template that we put out about a month ago. And then I also have a couple of other PSA updates to share with you today. So I wanted to jump right in and talk a little bit about some of the lessons that we've learned in our recent webinars. Just a reminder, throughout December, we hosted 10 webinars on pre-harvest agricultural water requirements. Six were in English, 4 were in Spanish. And one of the questions that we asked people when they registered, so just a reminder, these webinars were initially advertised to anybody who has previously taken a PSA grower training course. Initially, we just limited it to growers and or past grower training participants. And one of the questions that we asked them in the registration form was, were you aware of the recent FDA updates to the pre-harvest agricultural water requirements, to Subpart E? And interestingly enough, and this was something that shocked us, was that almost 50% of people overall were not aware of those Subpart E requirements. And here this chart kind of has a breakdown throughout different self-identified categories. So farm workers, farm owners, extension, produce industry, and then government employees, for example, regulators. And shockingly, so we split this into English and Spanish, the percentages of aware. And you can see that overall, farm workers were about 40% aware, farm owners were about 35% aware. So when we initially planned these webinars, each one of these was set in 2-hour blocks. And these responses quickly made us shift our approach in the webinar content. So we kind of shifted away from focusing on, okay, here's a little bit of information about what the requirements are, and then let's move into implementation. How do we get these requirements done? So this registration data quickly kind of had us shift away from that initial plan to really focusing on a presentation of revised module 5.1, which is the pre-harvest agricultural water requirements. And I want to highlight that there were some differences between English and Spanish. However, there is generally a lot of overlap between the two languages. And in the next couple of slides, I wanted to share, thank you, Michelle. Yes, we've learned over the years that asking, we always talk about in courses, know your audience. And we've learned over the years that when we ask registration questions, sometimes it can really become helpful. And at this point, kind of shift our entire approach. So a little bit of additional information on these webinars. I mentioned some of these numbers. After those December webinars, we did realize that the need was great, right? So people in hosting those 10 sessions in December, there were a lot of questions. And I mentioned here on the slide that our general approach was over that 2-hour session, using about 1 hour to present revised module 5.1 and then leave about an hour for question and answer. And shockingly enough, at least in my opinion, people tend to stay on for the entire session. So these working with Cornell licenses, generally these sessions have been limited to about 500 people because that's the Zoom license that we have. And I would say I was always shocked that we tell people they have to stay for the session in order to receive a certificate, but people stayed on for that entire 2-hour block. And people were asking questions in the questions and answer the box in the chat box, and very, very appreciative of the information according to evaluations, but very, very engaged. So what we also learned is that there needed to be additional methods for outreach. So what PSA did is that we took those sessions and then we decided to add on alternating English and Spanish sessions throughout the end of August through the cooperative agreement period. So what I wanted to share with you in the next couple of slides with that kind of brief summary, one of the roles that somebody has during these webinars is essentially their entire time is spent copying questions into a tracking Excel sheet. So we can sort of have an idea of the type of questions people are asking. So I wanted to share a little bit of that data with you in the next couple of slides. Over those 12 webinars, 10 in December, and then 1 each in English and Spanish in 2025 so far, we've recorded about 483 questions. And what I did is I bucketed those questions by topic area. And the reason I wanted to share this information with you as educators who are either currently teaching this information or hopefully planning to teach this information in the future is I want you to be prepared. I was a little surprised at the subject of some of the questions and the number, for example, the number of questions that we've been receiving about testing. So I wanted to share with you. I would also recommend, as you prepare, be prepared for any type of question. This might be obvious if you were presenting this during a PSA grower training course, but one of the lessons that I learned, and I know a lot of my coworkers or colleagues at PSA, is that we were getting questions about anything in the produce safety rule, really anything in produce safety. So I would say be prepared. A little bit more on that later. But I wanted to share with you, so I took these specifically English language questions and I focused on our data set from December. And that was about 165 questions. So just sort of broadly bucketing these, there were 27 questions, so about 17% were on testing alone. This was something that was, I think, surprising to us because, as you all know, in this webinar, the pre-harvest ag water requirements, the revised requirements, have sort of moved away from testing, moving away from that microbial water quality profile, that specific testing approach. So we just over and over received questions about testing, both in how often do I have to test? There was a lot of comparison to third-party audits. So we sort of took turns, whoever was presenting and then also helping answer questions. we found it effective to take turns and say, okay, I presented this, maybe you can answer some questions. Potentially a different voice would help with reiterating the message that testing is not a requirement in the pre-harvest ag water requirements. Testing can be used to support the agricultural water assessment, but it is not an explicit requirement as the microbial water quality profile was. The other big source of confusion about testing is, I just stated it's not explicitly required. However, testing is one of the exemptions. So testing can be used to access one of the exemptions from performing the agricultural water assessment. So really trying to hammer in that message and answer those questions was really tricky. One of the other, I would say after testing, the largest bucket where we received a lot of questions was definition of agricultural water. For those of you who have worked with the revised Module 5.1, you know that we added that whole list of is this agricultural water slides. So we added a few slides, tried to incorporate some back and forth in defining agricultural water. But then using that definition to help talk through when a agricultural water assessment needs to be done. So interestingly, a lot of the questions were very, very detailed scenarios saying, here's my operation, is this considered ag water? So I think there's still some confusion there, or at least participants really feel the need to sort of share their specific experience and talk through that. There were a lot of questions on water source. Interestingly, rainwater and rainwater capture is sort of a bucket within that. But then just generally talking through risk of water sources. So again, a lot of examples asking about municipal water, record keeping requirements for their groundwater, surface water. So again, very, very broad. And then some of the remaining buckets I wanted to highlight was, again, within that 165 question data set, die-off. So there were 9 or so questions, but we recognized this is a question that came up in, I would say, every single one of the English language webinars, the questions I looked through. So specifically asking about what are the recommendations for die-off rates, right? Recognizing that it is a measure that can be used within the new rule requirements, asking for fact sheets. And then sort of to summarize the other buckets, exemptions from the agricultural water assessment. Generally, these questions were asking about the very specific record keeping requirements that need to be done. So if somebody's using municipal water, what type of certificate of conformance are they looking for? But very much about the record keeping requirements to access that. And then I sort of just wanted to leave the last two bullets, I guess as a heads up for other educators. There were a lot of questions completely unrelated to pre-harvest agricultural water. And then also a lot of questions unrelated to agricultural water at all. And it seemed like people, this was an observation on my part, but people seem to be coming to these webinars. Sometimes we would get comments saying, it's been a few years. I don't remember how I determine if I'm exempt or excluded or covered under the rule. So we tended to get very specific questions that were not ag water related. And I will say as a heads up for other educators, I think I ended up pulling out my grower training manual and being like, man, it's been a little while since I've thought through the rarely consumed raw lists, for example. So it certainly kept us on our toes. But then the other buckets that I just wanted to highlight, not as many questions, but quite a few questions on post-harvest water, especially people not recognizing that a lot of the agricultural water assessment sort of that was really focused on the pre-harvest water. So a lot of questions about post-harvest water that were intended to be about pre-harvest, but just highlighting some of the sources of confusion, as well as specific treatment measures, methods, mitigation measures, and then a lot of requests for resources. So I wanted to spend those few minutes just kind of highlighting some of the very broad observations and questions that we've been answering during our outreach. But I wanted to kind of give you all the opportunity to give input and share some of your experiences. So I'm going to launch a poll, and bear with me because this is a new version of Zoom. So um, let me see. Excellent. I'll launch this, and hopefully you were viewing a poll here. So the first question, this is two questions. The first question is, have you taught the revised pre-harvest agricultural water requirements? I know this is a question that we have asked a couple of different times through various webinars, but I'm really curious in this specific audience here. And then the second question is, are you comfortable teaching the revised pre-harvest ag water requirements? And I'll give you all about 30 seconds or so to answer that. Okay. So it's looking like, oh, I'll give it another, it's still changing. Okay, I'm gonna end poll and share results. So it's looking like about 40% of you here have taught it. Okay, and I would say, so the majority of people have not taught it. Perfect. So in a grower training to stakeholders as an update in another format. Excellent. And then are you comfortable teaching the requirements? So the majority here is saying yes, no, unsure, and then about 40% saying probably but nervous. Excellent. So one of the reasons we wanted to host this webinar now is sort of, I would say we're about halfway through the training season for a lot of the country, and recognizing that we're seeing a lot of people who are teaching it. So we just sort of wanted to stop, give people a chance to ask questions and gauge how it's going. Okay, so I also wanted to talk a little bit, in the next slide, I'm going to sort of open it up for verbal discussion and get some additional input on your experiences in teaching these new requirements. But before we do so, I wanted to ask for your input as educators about a certificate of completion for Subpart E outreach. So if you remember last fall, so back in November, during the annual PSA Trainers update webinar, we asked everybody who attended, is providing growers a certificate of completion for attending some kind of agricultural water update, is that of interest? It was not really something that was on our radar, but there was a huge amount of interest from everybody who attended that webinar. So that sort of set our gears in motion, and we opted to develop this certificate of completion. You can see an example in the bottom right. For anybody on this call who has attended one of the update webinars, you will, if you've attended the full update webinar, you will have received that certificate. So we offer that certificate of completion for webinars or updates that PSA is involved in. And I wanted to ask you all for your input. So this certificate is something that could be offered for all PSA lead trainers. And by that I mean we could offer the option for you all to submit grower lists, and for those growers or those participants to receive a certificate of completion. And this would be a Produce Safety Alliance certificate. Now, if this process was developed, it would be in the context of having a process. They would have policies, and it would be specifically for PSA lead trainers to offer. So again, it would follow sort of normal PSA policy of hosting grower trainings. The other option, if you wanted this, is you could offer your own certificates of completion. I want to mention here that providing a certificate of completion is not a requirement. It is not a requirement in the produce safety rule. However, this is something that we had received some questions about. So I wanted to ask you all for your opinions. So I'm going to launch another poll, so give me a moment. But the question here is there interest in providing a PSA certificate of completion? Let me launch the poll. Launch. And this is just a quick one question poll, but we were looking to get some kind of feedback. Give it about 15 more seconds. Okay, and as people respond, I wanted to highlight that we had mentioned this before in a trainer email, and we really did not receive any interest from PSA trainers. We hadn't heard people asking, so I wanted to add this discussion to today's webinar to sort of check in. Okay, and because I'm sharing the results, and it looks like so 63% of people said yes, 12% said no, and 24% said not sure. So I think that helps us know a little bit more about if there is interest. And okay, so oops, there we go. Norm said, would this certificate be in addition to the AFTO certificate? So great question, Norm. And that is a great clarification question. So what I want to highlight here is people who are actively participating in grower training courses now will receive, they're seeing revised module 5.1, they're being presented that information. So they will receive a certificate, their normal PSA grower training course certificate from AFTO. This certificate, the one that you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, this is an additional certificate for those who specifically attend an outreach, as Subpart E update. It is intended for people who attended a grower training course before the revised requirements. So yes, Norm, that would be in addition to the AFTO certificate. I hope that clarifies. So I do want to ask people.
Donna, can I jump in for a second? Sure. Okay, so a couple of things I want to go a little more in depth to, just so we're all on the same page. So about the certificates. Hopefully you all on here who are trainers realize that we sent a note, an email in January inviting you to the Subpart E updates. And in that email, we tagged your trainer number. We did the same thing for growers, and we tagged their specific grower ID number or their grower number in those emails. And then we asked them when they registered to report that number. A lot of growers, even with that direct email to them, to their inbox with their actual grower ID number, did not put their grower ID number on the certificate. And the reason we originally put all the effort in, and I say we, not me, it'd be Rob and everybody who sets that up, was because we had wanted to pair their grower certificate in the database with the fact that they were updated for the Subpart E. And the reason for that was so that we could track how many people we had trained had been retrained, right? To know who we were missing. Once we figured out they were not even when we give them the information, they were not putting it on the registration form. We had to come up with a totally different way of offering certificates. So now those certificates, if you don't put your trainer ID or your grower ID, they're not linked in the database, but they are in the database in a separate group that can be searched. So that's point number one. Point number two, I know 26 out of 41 of you said you'd be interested in offering their certificate, with another 10 saying they weren't sure. I do just want to say, you know how PSA is with policy. We are going to make a policy about this, and then you're going to have to follow the policy. And a lot of people don't like following our policies, and they are unhappy with the policies. But the only way we know how to do things objectively and fairly is to try and create a policy and ask everyone to follow it, including ourselves. So I just want to say, just to reiterate, Donna said it, but Donna's a lot nicer than I am. I just want to say, like, if we go ahead and do this, we're willing to work on it, but it will be a lift for us. And I want those folks that said yes to realize, like, we're going to have rules about sort of what has to be covered and what has to be turned in and all of that stuff. So just wanted to put that caveat on it. Thank you, Donna. Sorry.
Thanks, Betsy. And I do want to highlight again that this, even if PSA developed a process for this as an option, it is optional. And I kind of wanted to go back to a comment that Nicole made in the chat box. So there's no requirement under the rule to have the certificate. That is correct. As soon as you start offering one, though, it takes a life of its own. And I know PSA has sort of had that discussion internally as well. But yeah, I just wanted to explicitly say the requirement in the rule, the educational requirement under 112.22C is that growers attend a PSA grower training course or an equivalent. So that is still the educational requirement in the rule.
There is a pair of comments that have to do with the cost of this. One is the cost to the person getting the certificate, and then Rhoda also asked the cost to PSA, and does that take us from other aspects of the work that we do?
Well, I think Donna's drinking, so I'm going to jump in. I think the deal is that it shouldn't take too much, right? Because internally within the PSA team, we've had a lot of debate about what actually constitutes being available for a certificate, right? So I don't think it'll be too much. But as one person is asking to relaunch the poll, which I'm not sure that's necessary, I just think it's one of these things where it's one more thing to follow. And Jose had said, oh, is mine linked to my certificate? And can I get mine linked? And this is where the time suck really comes. We do not have the time to link everybody's certificates together. That is just, we don't have the bandwidth to do that, which is why we came up with a different way of storing them. Somebody else, Nicole, great point. There is absolutely no requirement to A, be retrained, or B, to have a certificate. There's no requirement to have a PSA grower training certificate. You're just required to take a training, right? So want to make it clear that that is certainly true. But again, people really value these certificates. And so we want people to have all they say is certificate of completion. It doesn't say you learned everything you needed to learn. It just says you went through the training.
And I appreciate that feedback because yes, so I think it'll help PSA sort of determine how that process can move forward, and the need for that process.
To give the direct answer to the question about whether a participant will be asked to pay for the certificate, the answer was no, right?
Oh, yeah, no. The only thing that might creep in, depending on how demanding it gets, is if we have to start mailing stuff. Emails we can do. The surface mail might become an issue depending on what ends up happening with our current administration.
So I do want to give another moment for there to chance before I move over to the sort of the discussion, a broader discussion about presenting and answering questions about Subpart E. I want to take a moment and see if there's any other input on what a certificate process might look like. So this could be a wish list. And I want to say if you want to verbally have a question, or if you want to verbally provide input, there should be a button that says ask to unmute. Or sorry, if you raise your hand, I can allow individuals to unmute and talk. And I will just ask Don if you don't mind helping, because I know you're there. If you don't mind helping, if you see any hands, you can allow them to talk.
I can do that.
Thanks.
So just the hand raising is in the bottom center of your screen. If you don't know where that is, just it'll say that right next to chat. There we go.
Oh, Laurie might have been next.
That's our Laurie.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to move into the next slide, but that offer for providing input still applies. So if anybody wants to provide some input down the road, would be happy to accept that. Okay, so this slide, is sort of where I wanted to open up and just ask you all. I was looking at the registration list and the participant list here, and I know that there are a lot of people joining who are actively teaching this. So here's your chance to provide input. We have a couple of questions I wanted to start with. The first one being, what are some of the major points of points of confusion? So this could be from a technical aspect. I talked through some of the common questions that we have been seeing. But again, if you put your input in the chat box or raise your hand, I would love to hear if you're seeing similar things, if you're receiving a lot of questions about testing, if there's a question that you've been receiving and you just don't know how to answer or the approach that would be taken, all of that input is valuable. Oops, sorry.
There we go. Priscilla has one, so let me find her. There we go. Priscilla, you can unmute yourself.
So I don't necessarily, thank you both for hosting this. I appreciate the information that's provided. It's really good to know all the questions that have been asked. And mine's not a new question, but it just goes back to the testing question. I feel like there's just so much confusion about that. Growers are, their mentality was so much on water testing requirements that were initial. And I think now they get confused because there's still the testing requirement for the post-harvest water. So I think for me, that's been the biggest thing, is letting folks know they don't have to test. I don't know how we overcome that, and it's, continual information, but that seems to be a big one that I get. And that's not necessarily for me teaching the course, because I'm not necessarily teaching the course, but that's just between my communications with our membership and complying with this. That's where I see the biggest thing. And then I also get just folks that are even unaware that this new requirement is coming in April. So there's that aspect of it as well.
Thank you, Priscilla. I will say, and I know Michelle has her hand up. I will say there was a webinar, I think Don was presenting, and I think Don maybe repeated it like 4 times. And people were still asking, but what about testing? And they kept giving their own scenarios. And I think it was Betsy or somebody was finally like, can somebody else answer this? Because it's the way I'm trying to answer it is not being effective. So there is a lot of confusion there. Absolutely.
And a lot of that confusion, I think, comes from saying there is no requirement to test. And then when we get to exemptions, we say, if you test and it meets the testing requirements for post-harvest water, and then we give those explicit requirements, and then there is often confusion about, you just gave me requirements for testing, and following saying there were no requirements for testing. So it's clarifying your messaging on that can be super valuable.
And on that point, Don, that's a perfect lead in. I think that, at least for me, and I may be telling people that already have thought of this, I think that the point is that there's broad agreement of the quality of water that you need at and after harvest, that close to the consumer, and that quality that you need is non-detect for generic E. coli. When you back up to pre-harvest ag water, everyone's decided that it's more appropriate to focus on the assessment component, and there's not currently a requirement for testing there. The exception is that one of the exceptions to the ag water assessment is if you are using water that meets the criteria for post-harvest ag water, then you don't need to do that assessment. You still would need to do inspections and all the other things, but you don't need to do that assessment because you know that it meets the criteria for post-harvest ag water. How do you know it meets the criteria for post-harvest ag water? Look in post-harvest ag water. You either test, or if it's municipal water and you've got a certificate, but you're not, what you're doing is you're taking that exemption because you know that it meets those criteria. And it meets those criteria because you've either tested or have a certificate. I don't know if that would help.
Yeah, and getting that said clearly within the time and attention span, that is a trick that we all learn.
Yeah, so take mine and squish it down to about 20%.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Michelle. Donna, do you see the note from Jessica in the chat where she's talking about some of the experiences they had in Montana?
Yes,
The
thank
definition
you.
of ag water exemptions, water sources. And I guess I was wondering whether maybe whether Jessica wants to unmute and just share a little bit about their experience giving 5-1 and anything that you want to share with your fellow trainers about how to do it effectively. Raise your hand if you're game for that, Jessica. Or
We can unmute.
and then while we're waiting on that, we can address Annalisa, which we were talking in the chat. But Annalisa's talking about the templates and the scenarios of what does an egg water look like anyway. And I wonder if you wanted to share a little bit about that.
Yep. So yes, we do have in a sort of once the discussion is wrapped up, I wanted to save as much time as people wanted for the discussion. And toward the end of the slide set, I do have an example. I have some screenshots of our agricultural water assessment in the required records fact sheet. And in the version that is in the PDF, we have sort of pre-filled out with sample answers or example answers. And I can't remember exactly what Betsy put, but Betsy and I did well, we actually didn't even get to the scenarios, but we have sort of started developing scenarios to use in workshops or in outreach once we get past educating on what are the requirements and once we start moving into how do you implement the requirements. I think using scenarios and helping people fill out the template is really where it's impactful and kind of where those decisions are. And I can give some examples of that once I show you the template. Betsy.
Yeah, I will say that the workshop Donna and I did made me think differently about whether or not we need to use scenarios or not. Now, that might throw people off a bit, but when we were with the growers and we handed out the worksheets, what I found to be really interesting is we started by having them do a map for the ag water systems inspection, right? We started with here, map your own ag water systems inspection. And then when we moved along to the ag water assessment, I think depending on your crowd, you may just want to let the growers do their own farm, like start doing their own ag water assessment instead of working through a scenario. I think some scenarios might be good for some growers, but in the idea that nothing is universal, I guess I would say that depending on the size of the group, you might actually be able to just talk through the ag water assessment using their own farm as the scenario. So I think as we know in extension, there's a lot of ways to do the same thing. So I just want to put that out there as scenarios I think are good, but I think sometimes asking them to respond to their own farms is also helpful.
And Emily put in the chat box, we also see questions about exemptions and ultimately expectations of growers and what an adequate ag water assessment will look like without giving checklists. Absolutely. We have found the emphasis on the ag water definition is crucial for our growers and their understanding. And I will stop here to say that was a big conversation when we released Revised 5.1. I think it was Betsy was adamant. She's like, we need to put this in. And I think by adding it, I've seen more questions than ever on does this use even meet that definition? Is this even, required to have an ag water assessment? So I would definitely agree with you. We also see questions about differences between an ag water systems inspection and an ag water assessment, but we are also doing better about clarification of that point. Absolutely, Emily. And I think the fact that the agricultural water systems inspection is required for both pre-harvest and post-harvest water. And then the ag water assessment is just for pre-harvest water, but that there is that water systems component of the assessment that you can kind of pull in, I think it can get very confusing. Yeah. Any other, so we've sort of been, we've been talking through sort of major points of confusion. I also wanted to ask if you have any strategies that clarify confusing points. So do you have any like favorite examples that you provide or activities that help sort of navigate some of this confusion we're discussing, or favorite resources? And as I wait and see if there's any more examples, or if anybody else wants to chime in verbally and unmute, I will say to Emily's comment, a little bit later in the slides, I have, like I said, an example of the ag water template that we've released. We also, I think as of today, it's up in English on the website. We have updated our fact sheet on the differences between an agricultural water systems inspection and an agricultural water assessment. So that is up in English, and I think it's being finalized in Spanish. But I know that fact sheet is one of my favorites. I keep that printed out and in my manual for easy access.
So I have had the pleasure of hearing Annalisa discuss her comment in the chat a few times, and I think she says it succinctly and nicely. And I wonder if she would like to unmute herself just to present that concept of how GAPS ties in so closely with what we're trying to get across.
Well, sure, thanks. Yeah, I just was thinking that this is a good opportunity for us to not let these new words come across as confusing. If we ourselves as trainers are somewhat confused, which we probably are, I am, I think that that causes a lot of almost panic in our audience. So just kind of reducing the fear and the confusion and the worrying about, you know, corrective versus all the different language, and just kind of going back to that GAPS language. Of course, we do have to follow the rule, but I really think, especially for the first few years, most inspectors are going to be pretty rational. And if a grower has the language to describe, hey, you know, these are the risks that I've identified, and this is what I've done to reduce them, it seems like that should be sufficient, even if they don't remember the exact word in the revised rule. So not kind of overwhelming people with a bunch of jargon, because their eyes just glaze over. And at the end of the day, they might miss a really big thing, you know, kind of the most important strategies.
Thanks, Annalisa.
And then I promoted Teresa because she said something that I think is really valuable, and I don't if she wants to elaborate on it, that when you're in a group that you're pretty confident many of them will be exempt from doing an ag water assessment, sometimes it might be helpful as a strategy to let them know what the exemptions exclusions are, so that they don't get freaked out about something that they may not have to do. And did you want to elaborate on that, Teresa?
Yeah, there I am.
Yep, we can
I
hear
feel
you.
like, especially with our small farm growers, I mean, we tend to, as educators, we tend to front load the conversation, and really they just want to know, get to the end, right? And it's a lot of times it just falls down to, well, what are you using on your farm and where does it go? For the last 10 years, we've been encouraging farms, test your water. Even if you aren't required by PSR, test your water. It's a great way to figure this all out. So I feel like we've got a lot of growers at that testing spot, and then to come back and say, well, testing's not required anymore, but it's a good idea. And it's like, no, it's still a good idea to test, especially if you're using that water for post-harvest uses, you must test. But anyway, I find that a lot of the conversations end up being around, because a lot of the farms are using their well water for post-harvest operations, so they're already testing it. Then it comes down to their surface water uses, and are they even using surface water? And if they are using surface water, is it being used as agricultural water? Because that, you know, depending how they're using it, it may or may not apply. So I guess I tend to approach it from that angle and then remind folks that, especially the ones that tend to fall into that camp of where they don't have an exemption and they're using the surface water, that works for them. But I know that's not going to work everywhere, but it's worked in our state where a lot of farms are either on rural water or groundwater, and we don't have a lot of surface water use.
Thanks, Teresa. And I would add in, as I'm going to show the template in a moment, but I would add here in not to assume. So I myself done this. I sort of teaching to a group of people who primarily, because of their location, use either municipal water or well water. And I went through do these people really need to know this? Because do I need to spend 20 minutes talking about the ag water assessment? Because they're all going to qualify for the exemption. Well, turned out because these farms use so many wells, these growers were like, that's a lot of money. I have 10 wells that I'm going to use. I'm going to for sure just fill out that ag water assessment, fill out the template, keep that documentation. So I was really surprised that even though they were using wells that would qualify for an exemption, they opted to go with the agricultural water assessment to save that money for testing, because they were just using it pre-harvest. So that was a lesson that I learned, not to make some of those assumptions just based on the exemptions. Okay, so I'm going to shift over and I want to show you what some of our new resources look like, including the agricultural water assessment template. So feel free, we will have a couple of minutes at the end or throughout if you want to put in the chat box. Feel free to ask questions, especially now that you see at least PSA's version of a template that might jog some questions. So I think many of you are probably aware of the required records fact sheet. We released this way back, I think in 2017 or so, the original, and we recently updated this to include the new agricultural water assessment template, as well as an updated agricultural water systems inspection template. So one of the other big changes we made to this fact sheet is we've sort of fleshed it out to not only include items for farm created records, right? So we have those templates, but we've added content to the fact sheet itself to reflect where people can get the information, be it fact sheets or other resources for records that they are not created by the farm. So for example, if farms are purchasing commercial soil amendments, we have information on, additional fact sheets that might support that request. That QR code does go to the required records fact sheet. It's also posted on the general resources page on the website. But I wanted to take a couple of slides and talk you through what our template looks like. And I will tell you right up front, we are calling this version, I think it's version 2 of the required records template. And we are already discussing changes that we are making based on our uses of it over the last month or so. So just to highlight what you see on the screen, the templates is a blank set of fillable templates. And this is getting to Annalisa's comment of, it's really nice to see, how somebody might fill out this template, an example, or how they might fill it out based on a scenario. So if you download the required records template, the PDF fact sheet, those versions of the templates have examples. So you can see here on the screen, here's sort of the example of the top of the ag water assessment template, but in the all of the italicized font shows examples of what somebody might fill in that box. And I have a couple of screenshots here to show you, just sort of quickly talk through what this template looks like. So this is a 3-page, well, the agricultural water assessment template itself is 2 pages. And each of these boxes sort of breaks down a required element in the agricultural water assessment. And we designed this to sort of directly follow along the list in the codified language. So you can see this first one, the entire page or the first page of the Ag Water Assessment template talks to the agricultural water systems requirements. So here you can see what is that element moving left to right. Then on the that second column, we have the factor evaluated. So location and nature of the source, type of distribution system, degree of protection. All of these are pulled directly from that codified language. Then we have observation and condition. And then lastly, on the right, assessment of how that observation could influence risk. So you can see here, the observation or condition is really no bias, just looking at that observation and writing it down. So for example, we have a well example here. Well A is pumped into the holding pond prior to use to irrigate leafy greens crops. Thanks, Don, for circling. And then that right column is, how does that observation we just wrote down, how does that impact risk? So for this specific example, we see surface water is generally considered more valuable or vulnerable to contamination, and then sort of what that might mean for the risk of that water source. So that is the first page, is sort of walking through that agricultural, that systems element. The second page, I like to think of as the rest of the elements. So how is that water being used, right? Because when we talk about the definition of agricultural water, it contains how is that water being used? Is it contacting the crop? So that within that element, we look through the method of application, timing of application, and then the following rows, we have crop characteristics, environmental conditions, and then other factors, including testing, if applicable. So, and I see, yes, Priscilla, if nobody else drops that in, I can drop that in a second. The link to the required records. So what I want to highlight on this second sheet, I'm going to move forward to the next slide. And I want to highlight that the bottom of that second chart is where that written determination can be made. So that is essentially where the grower links, here is my agricultural water assessment, here are my observations and my analysis of, or my assessment of what those observations mean for risk. And then at the very bottom, they can make that written determination. So is this water not safe, not of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use? Is there one or more off-farm uses, essentially reasonably likely to introduce pathogens? Is there a condition on farm that's reasonably likely to introduce pathogens, or sort of no reasonably foreseeable hazardous conditions? Let's move ahead. And I want to highlight that we were very careful in writing these written determinations, and they directly align with, the language that's used in the PSA slide, as well as the FDA's flowchart. So if you think of that red, orange, yellow, green flowchart, that written determination language directly aligns with that. And the idea here is that a grower can sort of check off what they decide. And then the last chart, so this is the third chart in that sequence in the required records form, it includes measures. So if a grower, depending on their written determination, so depending on how they fill out that chart, they may be required to have a corrective measure or a mitigation measure. And this is the measures, a chart where that grower can record that. So it's sort of a sequence of templates. And I'm going to pause here and see, I'm looking at the time. I'm going to pause here and see if there were any questions. And thank you, Lori and Don, I think, for adding that link into the chat box. I will also say that this is sort of PSA's initial release into developing an ag water assessment. We are working on additional fact sheets to sort of support somebody in filling this out.
Could you go back 3, Donna, to the
Yes. Another one?
One more, yes. And I just want to point out something that was added partly because of other people's inputs, and Betsy's nodding her head because I think she wanted to go here too. I'm circling these elements, many of which are not actually part of Subpart E, just to illustrate that this is a systems approach, and many of the factors that are listed that could affect water quality are actually being managed in other subparts. 52A is about where do you put your manure pile. 130 is about do you, I believe that's actually hand washing and whether or not you're collecting the gray water. 134 and another one in that series of 130 through 134 is whether you're routing, whether you're taking your waste streams appropriately so as not to contaminate agricultural water. So there are other subparts in the produce safety rule that we rely on to maintain the quality of the agricultural water itself. So I just wanted to point that out. If I thought it was a typo at first.
Yeah, well, okay, so this is great, Don, because this starts a little bit higher level than where I was going to go. So I appreciate that. So one thing that is really important is when you start talking to growers and even yourself, when you look at Subpart E and you're like, you go to the determination step, go forward, Donna.
Yes, when, oh,
Yeah.
there we go, at the bottom.
Well, I was gonna, yeah. So when you look at this, no, you're fine. Oh, here's good, because it's blown up. When you look at this, water is safe, okay, fine. One or more off-farm uses, okay, and then one or more farm conditions on farm are reasonably likely, and you'll note off-farm. So if you look at how Subpart E is written, those on farms are not necessarily in Subpart E per se, and that's what Don is pointing out about those other sections that we added, is because when growers need to assess, not keep in mind that Subpart E is part of the PSR, right? It's part of the PSR. So when they're doing this assessment, we had to have a discussion about, are we only going to line up with Subpart E, or are we going to try and be inclusive of all the other segments of the PSR that deal directly with the quality of your agricultural water? And that's what Don was just pointing out. And then the other thing I want to point out that has caused a bit of confusion is when you get to the red, yellow, red, orange, yellow, green, here we go, where Donna has it highlighted now. Thank you, Donna. That first one, that if then, it's a double negative the way it's written, and it sometimes sounds funny when you read it. And so we've been trying to figure out, it gets even more complicated. I see my SLEAs on the call with us. It gets even more complicated when you translate it to a different language. So the kicker is that we tried to align our language with what FDA had so that we wouldn't have one answering yes and one answering no in some decision tree scheme. But I do just want to point out that that can be difficult for people to navigate. So those are my two things. Thanks, Donna.
Thank you both. And I added a comment into the chat box. I realize we're just at 3 o'clock. So I did want to mention that we are viewing this as a living document. So if you use this with growers, if you use it and fill it out with them, please do send us feedback. I think we've discussed, we all fully anticipate tweaks as this gets used. Okay, so very quickly, I just have a couple of slides to wrap up. I wanted to highlight that we are still putting out new PSA tools and resources. This screenshot on the bottom right is the updated fact sheet on the differences between the ag water systems inspection and the ag water assessment. That's what I think Emily was talking about before. So that's up on the website in English. But do keep an eye out on our general resources page and our trainer resources, because we are we have a lot of tools and resources in the pipeline. So Teresa asked if there is oh, Don answered, thank you. I do want to highlight a couple of external tools and resources as well. We have been relying pretty heavily on the 2024 preamble to the produce safety rule to help answer some of these technical questions. So just a reminder, that is a great resource for trainers. And then also the FDA Ag Water Assessment Builder is up on the FDA website. And I think that's a pretty good sort of tool to help talk through the elements, not necessarily to help. It's not a great tool it's more of a record keeping tool. It doesn't really help you make those decisions and make those determinations. I wanted to quickly, before I get to the end, just highlight for anybody who's interested, we are hosting more Subpart E webinars. We're hosting them in English and Spanish, essentially one a month. And that email was sent end of January, January 23rd at 12 o'clock Eastern. If you have questions, you can reach out to one of us as well. But I really wanted to highlight our on-demand video option. And I can, we will, in the follow-up email to this, I can send a list of the links that we've been discussing today. But this is on our general resources page under water, and it essentially allows participants to watch a recorded presentation of revised 5-1. And if they watch the whole presentation, they will receive a certificate. So sort of an on-demand option if they cannot catch one of those webinars. And then the last thing I want to mention is we do have 2 upcoming Train the Trainer courses. And registration is still open for both of those. So these are going to be hosted March 24th to 27th and June 9th through 12th. And both options are remote. So feel free to share with anybody who is interested in attending a Train the Trainer course. And those registrations are both, you can contact me or you can find both of those under the Train the Trainer section of the PSA website. And the last thing is just a very quick, if you have any input on future educators call topics that you would like to see, we're sort of rebooting the series. So please just reach out to me with any suggestions and I can work to get a speaker lined up. And with that, I want to thank everybody. Thank you for the participation. Those of you who unmuted, added questions to the chat box. And I will stick around for another minute or so if there are questions, but I appreciate all of that. And if you have any questions, input, you know where to find those of us on the PSA team. So thank you.
Don't hesitate to raise your hand or put in the chat if there are any follow-up questions. We're happy to continue to answer any questions you might have. So there's a question about PSA funding in version 2 of the manual.
Oh, sorry, I closed the Q&A. Thanks, Dad.
So right now, to the best of our knowledge, we are moving forward. We have funding through the end of August to help us work with the first rendition of V2. V2 completion will take 2 years because we want to pilot it, but we are still moving forward and we're still trying as best we know. We have that funding coming in and we are still here.
And then is there an update or an expectation to share about V2?
Well, that we're working on it and that we're hoping by the end of this that we will have a draft V2. The end of this year. I guess that was my point, Don.
Okay,
clarify if you want more clarity than that. Tell me what you want.
I probably got distracted during that key moment.
Okay.
Sorry. Michelle was asking how do people get a link, sign up for the update webinars, and March is already full, unfortunately, Michelle. If it's for you, we'll make something happen. So just email any of us. If it's for if you're asking to advertise it or something.
I'm already working on that, Don.
Okay, great.
Okay. I don't see any other questions, so I'm gonna close it down. Thank you all for
Good job, Donna.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a nice day, everybody.
Bye.